What if the person you were quietly saving didn't know they needed saving, and what if they were secretly saving you right back? For Kathleen Frady, a 22-year-old waitress with a body that betrayed her daily and medical bills that swallowed her whole, kindness wasn't a choice. It was all she had left. Her recipient was Daniel Parker, a stone-faced, impossibly demanding old man who claimed booth 6 every morning at precisely 6:30 a.m., a fortress of silence in a faded corner of the D&L diner. She served him with meticulous care, memorizing his severe dairy allergy, preparing his off-menu oatmeal in a completely sanitized pan, checking and rechecking his black coffee for any trace of contamination. She thought she was just doing her job, protecting a lonely, grumpy pensioner from a meal that could kill him. She had no idea he was watching her just as carefully. Because one bleak Thursday, the booth stayed empty. And when the diner door finally swung open, it wasn't Daniel who walked through. It was his senior attorney, flanked by 6 stone-faced bodyguards in tailored suits, and they were there for her. The life she'd been clinging to, the illness she'd been hiding, the dreams she'd buried, everything was about to be dragged into a spotlight she never asked for. Daniel Parker wasn't just a regular. He was a titan. And he'd left her a fortune with strings attached that would either destroy her or set her free. The 5:30 a.m. alarm was never loud enough to wake Kathleen Frady. It was the pain that did it, the deep, bone-grinding ache that pulsed through her joints, the dizziness that made the ceiling spin even while she was lying down, the exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning. Every morning was a negotiation with her own body, a silent bargain. Just get me through one more shift. Just one more. The D&L diner wasn't much to look at. It was a relic from another era, with cracked red vinyl booths, a checkerboard floor that had lost its shine decades ago, and fluorescent lights that buzzed with the persistence of insects. The air always smelled like burnt coffee, grease, and something vaguely sweet that might have been syrup or might have been rot. The regulars loved it for its consistency. Kathleen endured it because she had no choice. For the past 18 months, 6 days a week, she had performed the same ritual. Clock in at 5:45 a.m., tie her apron with hands that trembled just slightly, force down 2 painkillers with a gulp of water from the tap, and paint on a smile that felt like a mask. She moved through the narrow aisles with practiced efficiency, balancing plates with a grace that belied the vertigo clawing at the edges of her vision. She refilled coffee cups, delivered orders, and absorbed the complaints of customers who had no idea that each step she took was a small miracle of willpower. Her regulars were a predictable rotation. There was old Joe, the retired mailman who nursed a single cup of decaf for 2 hours while working a crossword puzzle in pen. There was the morning crew from the warehouse, loud and boisterous, who left crumpled bills and loose change scattered across the table. There was Mrs. Chen, who ordered the same egg white omelette every Tuesday and Thursday and always sent it back once for being too runny. And then there was Daniel Parker. He arrived every morning at 6:30 a.m. exactly. Not 6:28. Not 6:32. 6:30, he claimed booth 6 in the back corner, the one with the torn vinyl seat that no one else wanted, and he never varied. He was somewhere in his 70s, with silver hair combed back in severe lines, a sharp jaw that suggested he'd been handsome once, and eyes that were the color of winter steel. He wore expensive suits that seemed out of place in the D&L's worn-down atmosphere, charcoal gray, navy blue, always pressed, always perfect. He never smiled. He never made small talk. He simply sat, read his newspaper, and waited for his order. But his order was where Kathleen's real work began. Daniel Parker had a severe, life-threatening dairy allergy. He'd told her once, in a voice that expected absolute compliance, that even trace contamination could trigger anaphylactic shock. Most waitresses would have noted it and moved on. Kathleen became obsessed. She scrubbed his oatmeal pot herself every morning, checked the coffee pot for any residue from flavored creamers, interrogated the cooks about cross-contamination, and stood guard over his meal like a sentinel. When Tommy, the new line cook, nearly stirred Daniel's oatmeal with the same spoon he'd used for a cream-based soup, Kathleen had snatched the bowl away so fast it nearly shattered on the floor. "Are you trying to kill him?" she'd hissed, her voice low and fierce. Tommy had stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. But every time she delivered Daniel's meal, plain oatmeal, black coffee, no sugar, no cream, no butter, and watched him eat without incident, she felt something close to relief. She was saving his life, she thought. One bowl of oatmeal at a time. Daniel never thanked her. Not once. He'd nod, barely perceptible, and return to his newspaper. Sometimes she caught him watching her, his expression unreadable, but she always looked away. She told herself he was just a demanding old man, maybe lonely, maybe bitter, but ultimately harmless. She had no idea who he really was. She had no idea he'd been watching her for a reason. Because on that bleak Thursday morning in late October, when the autumn rain hammered against the diner windows and the sky was the color of old bruises, booth 6 stayed empty. Kathleen felt the absence like a punch to the sternum. She checked the clock obsessively, 6:30, 6:45, 7 o'clock, her hands shaking as she wiped down tables that didn't need cleaning. Something was wrong. Daniel Parker had never missed a morning. Not once in 18 months. At 7:32 a.m., the door opened. But it wasn't Daniel who walked in. It was a tall man in a black suit, his silver hair slicked back, his face carved from granite. Behind him, 6 more men in identical suits filed in like a phalanx, their expressions unreadable, their presence so imposing that the diner went silent. Forks stopped mid-air. Conversations died. Even the buzz of the fluorescent lights seemed to dim. The man in front scanned the room with the precision of a predator, and then his eyes locked on Kathleen. "Miss Kathleen Frady?" His voice was formal, clipped, and carried the weight of courtrooms and boardrooms. Kathleen's hand tightened around the coffee pot she was holding. Her legs felt like water. "Yes? My name is Jonathan Harrison. I'm the senior attorney for the estate of Daniel Parker." He paused, and the silence stretched like a wire about to snap. "I'm here to inform you that Mr. Parker passed away 3 days ago. And I'm here because you are named in his will." The coffee pot slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. The worst part about chronic illness wasn't the pain itself. It was the lying. Kathleen had become an expert liar over the past 18 months. She lied when her manager, Mr. Gus, asked why she'd called in sick 3 times last month. She lied when her mother asked if she was eating enough. She lied when the customers asked if she was feeling all right, because apparently exhaustion had a face and hers was wearing it. But most of all, she lied to herself every morning when the alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m. and she told her body that yes, it could do this one more time. This particular Wednesday, her body wasn't buying it. She'd woken up with the familiar cocktail of symptoms, the joint pain that made her feel like she was aging in fast forward, the dizziness that turned simple movements into calculated risks, and a fatigue so heavy it felt like gravity had doubled overnight. Her hands shook as she tied her hair back, and she'd already taken 3 painkillers, 2 more than recommended, but who was counting? The bathroom mirror reflected a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale as paper, 22 going on 60. The morning shift started the way it always did. Coffee for Joe. Eggs over easy for the warehouse crew. Egg white omelette for Mrs. Chen, sent back once because of course it was. Kathleen moved through the routine on autopilot, her smile a reflex, her small talk a script she'd memorized. But by 9 a.m., the edges of her vision had started to blur. She was carrying a tray of breakfast plates, 2 orders of pancakes, 1 corned beef hash, a side of bacon, when her left leg simply stopped working. Not dramatically. It didn't buckle or collapse. It just went numb, as if her brain had forgotten it existed, and suddenly the floor was rushing up to meet her. Kathleen twisted, throwing her weight sideways, and caught herself on the edge of a booth. The plates crashed to the floor in an explosion of ceramic and syrup. Bacon skittered across the linoleum like shrapnel. "Jesus, Frady." Mr. Gus's voice cut through the diner. He emerged from the kitchen, his face already red. "That's the third time this month." "I'm sorry, I slipped." The lie came automatically, smooth and practiced. She forced herself upright, ignoring the tremor in her legs, the way the room tilted like a ship in rough water. "Slipped." Gus's skepticism was a physical weight. He glanced at the floor, dry as bone, then back at her. "You're gonna slip yourself right out of a job if you keep this up. Clean it. Now." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and grabbed the mop from the back. Her hands were still shaking as she cleaned up the wreckage of someone else's breakfast, and all she could think was, "I can't lose this job. I can't. The bills won't wait. The pills won't prescribe themselves. The doctors won't accept apologies as payment." The mail came during her break at 2 p.m. She'd learned to time her breaks around mail delivery, a small mercy that let her intercept the bills before anyone else saw them. Today's envelope was from Mercy General Hospital, thick and official, and she already knew what was inside before she opened it. The number at the bottom made her stomach drop, $8,347.28. For one ER visit. 1. She'd gone in 3 weeks ago when the dizziness had gotten so bad she couldn't stand, when her heart had raced like a trapped bird, when she'd been certain she was dying. They'd run tests, pumped her full of 4 fluids, told her she needed to see a specialist, and sent her home with instructions she couldn't afford to follow. The specialist alone wanted $450 just for the consultation. The follow-up blood work would be another $200. The medications they'd recommended cost more than her weekly paycheck. She folded the bill carefully, creased it into quarters, and tucked it into her apron pocket where it sat like a stone. Her savings account had $127 in it. Her credit cards were maxed. Her mother's own medical bills from her bout with pneumonia last year still arrived monthly, smaller now but persistent, like paper-cut reminders that poverty was hereditary. Kathleen leaned against the brick wall behind the diner, closed her eyes, and did the math she'd done 100 times before. If she picked up extra shifts, if she skipped the specialist, if she stretched the painkillers, if she ate less, if she was very, very careful and very, very lucky, she might survive another month. Maybe 2. The bell above the diner door chimed. Another customer. Another dollar. Another lie. She straightened her apron, manufactured her smile, and went back inside. Tommy started on a Thursday, and Kathleen knew he was going to be a problem within the first hour. He was 19, cocky in the way only teenage boys could be, with a backwards baseball cap and the kind of swagger that suggested he'd never been told no in his life. Mr. Gus had hired him to replace Miguel, who'd finally saved enough to move his family out of state, and Tommy treated the kitchen like it was his personal kingdom. He blasted music from his phone, cursed loud enough for the customers to hear, and moved through the prep work with a speed that prioritized volume over precision. Kathleen had tried to brief him on the regulars during the morning rush. "The guy in booth 6, Daniel Parker, he has a severe dairy allergy. Life-threatening. You have to use the dedicated pot for his oatmeal, the one with the red tape on the handle. No butter, no milk, no cream, nothing even touches." Yeah, I got it." Tommy had waved her off without looking up from his phone. Oatmeal. Water. Not rocket science. She'd let it go then, because what choice did she have? But the unease had settled in her chest like a stone, and when 6:30 a.m. rolled around the next morning and Daniel Parker walked through the door with his usual mechanical precision, Kathleen felt her anxiety spike. Daniel claimed booth 6 without a word, unfolded his newspaper with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd performed this ritual 10,000 times, and waited. Kathleen placed his black coffee in front of him, checked twice, no creamer residue in the pot, and headed back to put in his oatmeal order. Tommy was already at the stove. "I got Parker's order," he called over his shoulder, and something in his tone made Kathleen's stomach drop. She pushed through the swinging kitchen door just as Tommy reached for the milk. "Wait," she started, but he was already pouring, a generous stream of whole milk splashing into the pot of oatmeal that was bubbling on the front burner. The pot with the red tape on the handle. "What the hell are you doing?" Kathleen's voice came out sharper than she'd intended, loud enough that the other line cook, Rita, looked up from the grill. Tommy turned, milk carton still in hand, his expression somewhere between confused and annoyed. "Making it creamy? Customers like. That's Daniel Parker's oatmeal." Kathleen crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and snatched the pot off the burner. The metal handle seared her palm, but she barely felt it. "He has a severe dairy allergy." "Severe? As in his throat closes up and he dies?" "Jesus, relax." Tommy set the milk down, but his tone was defensive. "It's just a little milk. I'll make him another one." "With what?" Kathleen's hand was shaking, the pot trembling in her grip. "You just contaminated the only dairy-free pot we have. Now everything in here has milk residue. The spoon you used, the burner, all of it." Rita had stopped cooking entirely now, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. Tommy's face had gone red. "I didn't know. I told you yesterday. I specifically told you." Kathleen set the pot down in the sink and grabbed the dedicated scrub brush they kept for allergen cleaning. Her palm throbbed where the handle had burned it, but she ignored it. "You're going to wash this pot. With soap. 3 times. Then you're going to wipe down the entire prep area, and then you're going to make his oatmeal exactly the way I showed you. Plain. Water only. Nothing else touches that pot. You can't tell me." "I just did." Kathleen met his eyes, and something in her expression must have been fierce enough to cut through his ego because he actually shut up. "You almost killed someone because you weren't paying attention. So yes, I can tell you. And you're going to listen." The kitchen went silent except for the sizzle of Rita's bacon on the grill. Tommy stared at Kathleen for a long moment, his jaw working, and she could see the calculation in his eyes, whether to push back, whether to go to Gus, whether to make this a fight. Then he grabbed the pot and turned on the water. Kathleen supervised every step. Watched him scrub the pot 3 times with soap. Watched him dry it with a clean towel. Watched him measure the oats, add the water, and cook it without any additions. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften her tone. When the oatmeal was finally ready, she carried it out herself. Daniel was still reading his newspaper, his coffee half finished. Kathleen set the bowl down in front of him with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and she waited, for what, she wasn't sure. Acknowledgement, maybe. Understanding. Daniel looked up from his paper. His steel-gray eyes met hers, and for a moment she thought he might say something. He'd been there long enough to hear the commotion, the raised voices from the kitchen. He had to know something had happened. Instead, he gave her a single nod. Barely perceptible. Just the slightest dip of his chin. Then he picked up his spoon and began to eat. Kathleen walked back to the kitchen, her burned palm still throbbing, and thought, he knows. He knows, and that's enough. 6:30 a.m. came and went, and booth 6 stayed empty. Kathleen had been watching the door since 6:15, her anxiety building with each passing minute. She'd refilled Joe's coffee 3 times without him asking, wiped down the same table twice, and rearranged the sugar packets in their holder with trembling fingers. By 6:45, the unease had transformed into something darker, something that felt uncomfortably close to panic. Daniel Parker had never been late. Not once in 18 months. He arrived at 6:30 a.m. with the reliability of an atomic clock, claimed his booth, and ordered his oatmeal. It was a constant in a world where Kathleen's body betrayed her daily, where bills arrived like clockwork, where nothing was certain. And now he was gone. "You okay, hon?" Rita had come out from the kitchen, her expression concerned. "You look pale." "I'm fine." The lie felt hollow even as she said it. "Just." Mr. Parker didn't come in today. Maybe he's sick. Old people get sick. Rita shrugged, but her tone was gentle. I'm sure he's fine. But Kathleen wasn't sure. She couldn't shake the image of Daniel alone in some apartment, his throat closing from accidental contamination, no one there to call for help. What if he'd gone to a different restaurant? What if some careless cook hadn't known about his allergy? What if the last thing she'd done for him hadn't been enough? By 7:30, her hands had started shaking badly enough that she had to set down the coffee pot. The dizziness was back, creeping in at the edges of her vision like dark water. She'd skipped breakfast to save money, and she'd already taken her painkillers on an empty stomach, which always made the vertigo worse. The combination of anxiety and illness was creating a perfect storm in her body. Frady. Gus's voice cut through the diner. Table 4's been waiting 10 minutes for their check. She turned too fast. The room tilted, and suddenly the floor wasn't where it was supposed to be. She caught herself on the counter, her knuckles white, her breath coming in short gasps. I'll get it, she managed, but her voice sounded far away. She made it to table 4. Smiled at the couple. Processed their payment. But by the time she reached the kitchen, black spots were dancing across her vision like static on a television screen. The back room was 3 steps away. She could make it 3 steps. She made it 2. Her legs gave out without warning, and this time there was no catching herself. She hit the tile floor hard, her shoulder taking most of the impact, and the world narrowed to a pinpoint of light before disappearing entirely. When she came to, Rita was crouched beside her, her face worried. Don't move, sweetie. Just breathe. I'm fine. Kathleen tried to sit up, but Rita's hand on her shoulder kept her down. You passed out. That's not fine. I just need a minute. What you need is a hospital. Rita's voice was firm. This is the second time I've seen you nearly collapse this week. I can't afford. Kathleen stopped herself, but it was too late. Rita's expression shifted from concern to understanding, and that was somehow worse. The back room door slammed open. Gus stood in the doorway, his face the particular shade of red that meant someone was about to get fired. Are you kidding me right now, Frady? She passed out, Rita said, her tone defensive. She needs to decide if she wants to work here or not. Gus's voice was cold. Because I can't run a diner with a waitress who drops plates, spaces out, and now faints in the middle of a shift. This is a business, not a charity. Kathleen forced herself upright, ignoring the way the room spun. I'm sorry. It won't happen again. You're damn right it won't. Gus crossed his arms. This is your last warning, Frady. One more incident, one more, and you're done. I don't care if you've been here 3 years. I can't have unreliable staff. I understand. Good. He turned to leave, then paused. And for God's sake, eat something. You look like death. The door swung shut behind him. Rita helped Kathleen to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. You should go home. I can't. Kathleen's voice was barely a whisper. I need the hours. Rita didn't argue. She just squeezed Kathleen's hand once, then headed back to the kitchen. Kathleen stood alone in the back room, her shoulder aching, her vision still spotty, and thought about booth 6. About the empty space where Daniel Parker should have been. About how quickly everything could disappear, jobs, health, people, and how little control she had over any of it. She straightened her apron, checked her reflection in the small mirror by the time clock, and went back to work. 3 days later, the door opened at 7:32 a.m., and everything changed. Kathleen was refilling coffee for the warehouse crew when the bell chimed. She glanced up out of habit, and the coffee pot froze halfway to the cup. The man who entered was tall, silver-haired, and wearing a suit that probably cost more than her car. But it wasn't him that made the diner go silent. It was the 6 men who followed him inside. They moved with military precision, fanning out across the small space in a formation that was clearly rehearsed. All 6 wore identical black suits, white shirts, and dark ties. Their faces could have been carved from stone. They didn't look at the menu board or the customers. They looked at exits, sight lines, potential threats. The kind of men who were paid to see danger everywhere. The diner had gone completely quiet. Forks hovered mid-air. Joe's crossword puzzle lay forgotten. Even the background music from the jukebox seemed to have gotten quieter, though Kathleen knew that was impossible. The silver-haired man scanned the room with clinical efficiency, and then his eyes locked on her. Miss Kathleen Frady? Her mouth had gone dry. The coffee pot trembled in her hand. Yes? My name is Jonathan Harrison. His voice was formal, precise, with the kind of diction that came from expensive schools and courtrooms. I'm the senior attorney for the estate of Daniel Parker. The name hit her like a physical blow. Daniel. The empty booth. 3 days of anxiety crystallizing into a single, terrible certainty. I'm here to inform you that Mr. Parker passed away 4 days ago. Harrison's expression didn't change, but something in his tone suggested he'd delivered this news many times before. And I'm here because you are named in his will. The coffee pot slipped from Kathleen's fingers. It hit the floor in an explosion of glass and hot liquid, splashing across the checkerboard tile. She barely noticed. Her ears were ringing, her vision tunneling. Named in his will. Daniel Parker. Dead. I don't, her voice came out as a whisper. I don't understand. Mr. Parker was the founder and CEO of Parker Pharmaceuticals. Harrison pulled a leather portfolio from his briefcase, every movement controlled. He left specific instructions that you be notified immediately and brought to our offices for the formal reading of his will. If you'll come with me, please. Parker Pharmaceuticals. The name echoed in her head. She'd seen their commercials on television, their logo on medication bottles. One of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country. And Daniel, grumpy, silent, demanding Daniel who sat in booth 6 and ate plain oatmeal, had been running it? I'm working, she said stupidly. I can't just. Miss Frady. Harrison's tone gentled slightly, the first hint of humanity breaking through his professional facade. This is not a request. Mr. Parker's will is time-sensitive, and you are a primary beneficiary. Your presence is required. Gus had emerged from the kitchen, his face cycling through confusion, suspicion, and something that might have been calculation. What's going on here? Mr. Parker's attorney, Kathleen managed. He says Daniel left me something. Daniel? Gus looked at Harrison, then at the 6 stone-faced men positioned throughout his diner, then back at Kathleen. You mean the old guy from booth 6? What could he possibly? That's confidential. Harrison closed his portfolio with a decisive snap. Miss Frady, we have a car waiting. Please collect your belongings. It wasn't a suggestion. 2 of the bodyguards had moved closer, not threatening but present, their message clear. She was leaving with them whether she wanted to or not. Kathleen's hands were shaking as she untied her apron. She felt like she was moving through water, everything slow and distant. The other waitress, Sarah, was staring at her with wide eyes. The warehouse crew had their phones out, probably already texting about this. Joe had actually abandoned his crossword puzzle entirely. She grabbed her purse from the back room, her mind spinning. Daniel was dead. Daniel had left her something in his will. Daniel was a billionaire CEO, and she'd been serving him oatmeal in a rundown diner for 18 months without having any idea who he really was. Harrison held the door open. The 6 bodyguards formed a perimeter around her as she stepped outside into the cool morning air. A black Mercedes was idling at the curb, sleek and spotless, completely alien against the backdrop of the DNL's cracked parking lot. Through the diner window, she could see Gus, Sarah, Joe, the warehouse crew, all of them pressed against the glass, watching. Kathleen Frady, the sick waitress who could barely afford her medication, being escorted away by lawyers and bodyguards like she was someone who mattered. The car door closed with a sound like a vault ceiling, and Booth 6 disappeared from view. The Parker Pharmaceuticals building was glass and steel, 30 stories of wealth and power that pierced the downtown skyline like a blade. Kathleen's reflection in the lobby's polished marble floor looked small and out of place, a tired waitress in a coffee-stained uniform surrounded by people in $1,000 suits. Harrison led her to a private elevator that required a key card. The ride to the 28th floor was silent except for the soft hum of machinery. When the doors opened, she stepped into a world that felt designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, modern art that probably cost more than her mother's house, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. The conference room was worse. A massive table dominated the space, dark wood polished to a mirror shine. At the far end sat a woman in her early 50s, blonde and perfectly composed in a charcoal gray suit. Her makeup was flawless, her jewelry understated but clearly expensive. When she looked at Kathleen, her blue eyes were colder than winter steel. "This is her." The woman's voice dripped with disdain. "This is the waitress?" "Veronica Parker," Harrison said quietly. "Daniel's daughter." Next to Veronica sat a younger man, maybe 35, with the kind of angular features and calculated smile that belonged to someone who'd never been told no. He wore a navy suit that screamed money and leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of inherited wealth. "Julian Parker," Harrison continued. "Daniel's nephew and current VP of operations." Julian's eyes traveled over Kathleen with open contempt, from her scuffed shoes to her pulled-back hair. "Jesus Christ. Dad really scraped the bottom of the barrel this time, didn't he? That's enough." Harrison's tone was sharp. He gestured to a chair. "Miss Frady, please sit." Kathleen lowered herself into the leather chair, acutely aware of how out of place she was. Her hands were shaking again, but now it wasn't from illness, it was from the weight of their stares, the obvious hostility radiating from Daniel's family like heat from a furnace. Harrison opened his briefcase and removed a thick document bound in blue leather. "We're here for the reading of Daniel Michael Parker's last will and testament. As you know, Mr. Parker passed away on October 23 from complications related to a cardiac event." Cardiac event. The clinical term for death. Kathleen felt a wave of grief that surprised her with its intensity. She'd barely known him. He'd barely spoken to her. But for 18 months, he'd been a constant, and now he was gone. Harrison began reading. Most of it was legal jargon that washed over Kathleen without comprehension. Charitable foundations. Stock portfolios. Real estate holdings. Veronica received the family estate in Connecticut. Julian received a position on the board of directors, pending certain conditions. Then Harrison's voice changed, gaining weight. "To Kathleen Marie Frady, for her unwavering compassion and vigilant care, I bequeath the sum of $500,000, to be used specifically for her medical treatment and well-being." The room tilted. 500,000. Kathleen couldn't breathe. Additionally, Harrison continued, "I bequeath to Miss Frady the property and business known as the DNL Diner, along with a $10 million endowment fund to be administered by the Parker Foundation. This fund is to be used exclusively for research into chronic and rare illnesses, with Miss Frady serving as the primary advisor and decision-maker." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Julian exploded. "Are you fucking kidding me?" He surged to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. $10 million? To some waitress? This is insane. "Julian," Veronica's voice was ice. "No." He pointed at Kathleen, his face flushed with rage. "This is bullshit. She's a nobody. A low-life opportunist who probably manipulated a senile old man. Mr. Parker was not senile, Harrison interrupted, his tone deadly calm. He was of sound mind and body when he drafted this will 6 weeks ago. It was witnessed by 3 independent attorneys and a physician. Then she conned him. Julian slammed his palm on the table. Look at her. She's a broke waitress with a bleeding heart routine, and she saw a rich old man and saw her meal ticket. Kathleen flinched as if she'd been struck. Her face burned with shame and anger, but her voice wouldn't work. The accusations hung in the air like poison. That's enough. Harrison stood, gathering his papers. The will is legally binding. Miss Frady's bequest stands. If you wish to contest it, you may hire your own attorneys, but I can tell you now that you will lose. Veronica hadn't moved, but her eyes never left Kathleen. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and infinitely more dangerous than Julian's shouting. My father was a brilliant man. But even brilliant men can be fooled by a pretty face and a sad story. She stood, smoothed her suit, and walked out without another word. Julian followed, but not before leaning close to Kathleen. You think you've won something? You have no idea what you just walked into. Then he was gone, and Kathleen was alone with Harrison in a conference room worth more than everything she'd ever owned, holding a future she didn't understand. The specialist's office didn't smell like disinfectant and desperation. It smelled like expensive leather and fresh flowers. Dr. Sarah Chen was everything the ER doctors hadn't been: patient, thorough, and willing to actually listen. She spent 2 hours with Kathleen on that first appointment, asking questions that no one had ever asked, ordering tests that Kathleen had only dreamed of affording. When the results came back 3 days later, Dr. Chen delivered the diagnosis with gentle certainty: severe anemia complicated by early-stage lupus, both treatable with proper medication and management. You've been living in crisis mode, Dr. Chen had said, her expression sympathetic. Your body's been fighting a war without supplies. But we can fix this. It won't be overnight, but we can get you stable. The prescription alone would have bankrupted her a week ago. Now, standing at the pharmacy counter with her new insurance card, the kind that came with $500,000 inheritances, Kathleen felt like she was living someone else's life. Harrison had called 2 days after the will reading with an unexpected message. Daniel's estate included his personal residence, and before it was sold, Kathleen was welcome to visit. There were some things, Harrison said carefully, that Mr. Parker had wanted her to see. The mansion sat on 5 acres of manicured grounds in the wealthiest part of the city, all stone and glass and old money. A housekeeper named Margaret met her at the door, her expression kind but reserved, and led her through rooms that felt more like museums than living spaces. Mr. Parker's study is upstairs, Margaret said softly. He left specific instructions that you were to have access. The key is on his desk. The study was exactly what Kathleen had expected from Daniel: dark wood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, furniture that was expensive but functional rather than showy. A massive desk dominated the space, its surface clear except for a single manila folder and a small brass key. Kathleen picked up the folder with trembling hands. Her name was written on the tab in precise, angular handwriting. Inside were medical records, not just her recent hospital visits, but everything. Lab results she'd never been able to afford. Specialist consultations she'd never attended. Progress notes from doctors she'd never met. Daniel had been having her followed. No, not followed. Monitored. Cared for. Every time she'd gone to the ER, every time she'd struggled through a shift, someone had been documenting it, tracking her decline, watching her sacrifice herself day by day. At the bottom of the file was a handwritten note on heavy cardstock, Daniel's distinctive script unmistakable. Kathleen. You spent 18 months making sure I didn't kill myself with a glass of milk. You never asked for anything in return. You never complained. You never failed, even when your own body was failing you.
I spent 18 months watching you refuse to save yourself. watching you choose everyone else's well-being over your own, watching you slowly disappear. This inheritance isn't charity. It's payment for a debt I can never fully repay. You saved my life more times than you know. Now take care of the one thing you wouldn't, yourself. The key opens the cabinet behind the desk. Inside, you'll find the rest.
Dippy.
Kathleen's hands shook as she picked up the brass key. The cabinet was hidden in the wood paneling, barely visible until she knew to look for it. Inside were more files, dozens of them, but these weren't about her. They were about Parker Pharmaceuticals, corporate structure, financial reports, research initiatives, and prominently, repeatedly, a proposal labeled Parker Compassion Initiative, a philanthropic restructuring. The documents told a story. Daniel had been planning this for over a year, building a case for transforming part of his pharmaceutical empire into a foundation focused on chronic illness research and patient support. The kind of illnesses that were expensive to study, unprofitable to treat, invisible to most people. The kind of illnesses that had been slowly killing her. Julian's name appeared throughout the documents, always in opposition, blocking proposals, diverting funds, arguing that compassion didn't pay dividends. The picture was clear. Daniel had been fighting his own family to make this happen, and he'd been losing. Until now. Kathleen spread the documents across the desk, her mind racing. The diner, the endowment fund, her position as primary advisor, none of it was random. Daniel hadn't just left her money. He'd left her a weapon. The means and the authority to finish what he'd started, to force the change that his family had been blocking for years. She picked up his note again, reading the last line. Take care of the one thing you wouldn't, yourself. For the first time since the lawyers had walked into the D&L diner, Kathleen felt something other than confusion and grief. She felt purpose. She felt angry. And underneath it all, she felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in 18 months. She felt strong. Kathleen spent 3 days in Daniel's study, and by the end she understood exactly what he'd been doing. The corporate dossiers were meticulous, organized by date and category. Financial projections, board meeting minutes, email chains. Daniel had documented everything with the precision of a man building a legal case, which she realized was exactly what he'd been doing. Each file painted a picture of a company at war with itself. Innovation versus profit, compassion versus quarterly returns, legacy versus greed. The earliest documents dated back 2 years. A proposal from Daniel to redirect 30% of Parker Pharmaceuticals' annual profits into a research foundation focused on rare and chronic diseases. Illnesses that affected millions but generated minimal revenue. Conditions that destroyed lives slowly, invisibly, without the drama of a cancer diagnosis or the immediacy of a heart attack. The kinds of illnesses that insurance companies hated and pharmaceutical companies ignored because there was no money in mercy. Julian's response had been swift and vicious. A 10-page memo arguing that Daniel was suffering from emotional decision-making and age-related cognitive decline. That the proposed foundation would crater their stock price. That shareholders would revolt. That compassion was not a business model. The board had sided with Julian, 5-3, but Daniel hadn't given up. He'd simply changed tactics. Kathleen found a folder labeled Case Studies that made her stomach turn. Detailed profiles of Parker Pharmaceuticals employees and their families, people struggling with chronic illnesses, drowning in medical debt, choosing between medication and rent. Each profile included photos, medical records, financial statements. At the bottom of each file, Daniel had written notes in his precise handwriting. Denied insurance coverage. Cost, $2,340 per month. Salary, $3,200 per month. Unsustainable. Then she found her own profile. It was thicker than the others, more detailed. Photos of her at the diner, taken from outside through the window. Medical bills with amounts highlighted in red. A timeline of her decline, dates when she'd called in sick, incidents when she'd nearly collapsed, the progression of her symptoms documented with clinical precision. On the last page, Daniel had written a single sentence. She will die before she asks for help. Like Evelyn. Evelyn. Kathleen flipped back through the files until she found it. A worn photograph tucked into a leather folder. A woman in her 30s, dark-haired and smiling, standing next to a younger Daniel. On the back, in faded ink, Evelyn Parker, 1962 to 1998. The attached obituary was brief. Complications from lupus. Daniel's wife had died at 36 from the same disease that was slowly killing Kathleen. She'd refused aggressive treatment, the article noted, because the cost would have bankrupted Daniel's fledgling pharmaceutical company. She'd chosen his dream over her life. Kathleen sat back in the leather chair, her eyes burning. Daniel hadn't been studying her. He'd been seeing his wife, watching history repeat itself in a rundown diner booth, watching another woman sacrifice herself on the altar of other people's needs. And this time he'd had the power to stop it. The Parker Compassion Initiative wasn't just a philanthropic proposal. It was personal. It was penance. She found the full strategic plan in the bottom drawer, bound in blue leather and marked, Final Draft, Board Presentation, November 15th. 3 weeks from now. Daniel had been planning to force a vote, to use his majority shares to override Julian's opposition. The plan was brilliant. Restructure the company into 2 divisions, traditional pharmaceuticals and the new Compassion Initiative. Use the foundation's research to develop treatments for chronic illnesses, then offer them at cost to patients who couldn't afford them. Create a model that proved profit and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. But Daniel wouldn't be there to present it. And without his shares, without his voice, Julian would kill it before it ever reached a vote. Unless Kathleen pulled out the inheritance documents Harrison had given her. Buried in the legal language was a clause she'd missed. As beneficiary of the endowment fund and advisor to the Parker Foundation, she held a non-voting seat on the Parker Pharmaceuticals board. She couldn't vote, but she could speak. She could present. She could force Julian to face Daniel's vision in front of the entire board. The diner. She finally understood the diner. It wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol. The D&L diner represented everything Julian despised. Ordinary people, modest means, the kind of place where a billionaire could sit unrecognized and be treated with simple human kindness. Daniel had made it untouchable, wrapped it in a $10 million endowment, and handed it to the woman who'd served him oatmeal for 18 months without ever asking who he was or what he could do for her. The woman who'd saved his life repeatedly, just because it was the right thing to do. Kathleen spread the board presentation across the desk and began to read. She had 3 weeks to learn corporate strategy, pharmaceutical economics, and how to speak the language of boardrooms. 3 weeks to become someone who could stand in front of Daniel's family and his company and demand they honor his vision. 3 weeks to transform from a dying waitress into a warrior. She picked up her phone and called Harrison. I need to understand how board meetings work. And I need to know everything you know about Julian Parker's business practices. Everything. There was a pause. Then Harrison's voice came through with something that might have been satisfaction. I was hoping you'd call. When can you start? The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of learning and transformation. Harrison became her unlikely mentor, meeting her 3 times a week in a small conference room at his law firm. He taught her how to read financial statements, how to navigate corporate hierarchy, how to speak in boardrooms without being dismissed. You're not a waitress anymore, he told her on the first day. You're a foundation director and a board advisor. Act like it. Dr. Chen's treatments were working. The medications had stabilized her blood counts, reduced the inflammation, given her body the resources it needed to fight back. For the first time in 18 months, Kathleen woke up without the immediate calculation of how much pain she could endure. She still tired easily, still had bad days, but the constant threat of collapse had receded to a manageable whisper. The diner had become her project. She'd promoted Rita to manager, given the entire staff raises, and started renovations that would modernize the kitchen while keeping the character that made the D&L feel like home. Booth 6 stayed exactly as it was. She'd had a small brass plaque made and mounted on the wall above it, in memory of Daniel Parker, who found kindness here. She was reviewing contractor estimates when Harrison called, his voice tight with controlled anger. Have you seen the article? Her stomach dropped. What article? Check your email. I'm sending it now. The headline made her nauseated. Parker heirs mystery beneficiary. Dying waitress or cunning con artist? The article was published in Corporate Insider, a tabloid masquerading as business journalism. It had everything. Photos of her looking exhausted at the diner, details of her medical history that should have been private, quotes from anonymous sources claiming she'd manipulated a vulnerable old man. But the worst part was the medical prognosis, leaked from her old ER records. Sources close to the situation revealed that Ms. Frady was given a poor prognosis just weeks before Mr. Parker's death, with doctors estimating she had less than a year to live without aggressive treatment. Questions arise about her mental and physical fitness to manage a $10 million endowment. She's clearly unstable, says one Parker Pharmaceuticals executive who wished to remain anonymous. Giving someone that's sick that much power is irresponsible at best, dangerous at worst. Kathleen's hands were shaking as she scrolled through the article. They'd made her sound like a dying grifter, too sick to think clearly, too desperate to be honest. The comments section was already filling with speculation and vitriol. "Julian," she said flatly. "Almost certainly." Harrison's voice was grim. The medical records had to come from inside Parker Pharmaceuticals. He's trying to build a case for contesting the will, claiming Daniel was manipulated by someone who was mentally compromised by illness. Can he do that? He can try. But Kathleen, this is worse than a legal challenge. This is a public relations attack. He's trying to destroy your credibility before you ever walk into that boardroom. If the board believes you're unstable, it won't matter what you present. They'll dismiss you as a sympathetic but incompetent charity case. Kathleen stared at her reflection in the dark window of the diner's office. 2 weeks ago, that's exactly what she would have believed about herself. The sick waitress in over her head. The dying woman playing at being important. But Daniel hadn't thought she was incompetent. He'd thought she was strong enough to finish what he'd started. "What do we do?" she asked. Harrison was quiet for a moment. "We have 2 options. We can try to fight this quietly, issue a statement through lawyers, hope it blows over. Or you own it. You walk into that boardroom in 3 days and you make your illness your strength, not your weakness. You show them exactly why Daniel chose you." Kathleen thought about Daniel's note. Take care of the one thing you wouldn't yourself. But maybe taking care of herself didn't mean hiding. Maybe it meant standing up. "I need everything you can find on Julian," she said, her voice steady. "Every questionable business deal, every financial irregularity, everything Daniel documented. If he wants to make this about fitness to manage money, let's talk about his track record. That's playing dirty. He started it." Kathleen pulled up Daniel's files on her laptop, the ones she'd been studying for 2 weeks. "Julian's been embezzling from the company for years, hasn't he? Small amounts, carefully hidden, but it's there in Daniel's notes. Daniel was building a case before he died." Harrison's silence was confirmation enough. "Then I'm finishing it," Kathleen said. "Send me everything. And Harrison, thank you for believing I'm not crazy."
"Miss Frady," Harrison said, and she could hear the smile in his voice, "I've been Daniel Parker's attorney for 30 years. The man didn't do anything without a reason. If he chose you, then you're exactly who we need." Kathleen ended the call and returned to Daniel's documents, but this time she wasn't studying them as a student. She was studying them as a prosecutor. Julian wanted to make her illness the story? Fine. She'd make his corruption the headline. The boardroom was full when Kathleen arrived, every seat occupied by men and women in suits that cost more than her car used to. She wore a simple navy dress that Harrison had helped her choose, professional but not pretentious, strong but not flashy. Her hands weren't shaking. Dr. Chen's latest blood work had been good, and for the first time in 2 years, her body felt like an ally instead of an enemy. Julian sat at the head of the table in Daniel's old chair, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Veronica was beside him, perfectly composed as always. The other board members watched Kathleen with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to outright pity. "Let's begin." Julian's voice carried the confidence of someone who thought he'd already won. "As you all know, my uncles will included some unusual provisions. While we respect his wishes, recent information has come to light regarding Miss Frady's fitness to manage the substantial resources she's been given. He pulled up a slide, the Corporate Insider article, enlarged so everyone could see the headline. Miss Frady was quite literally dying when she supposedly befriended my uncle. She has a history of medical instability, cognitive impairment from chronic illness, and financial desperation. I move that we challenge the will on the grounds that she manipulated a vulnerable elderly man during a period when she was not of sound mind herself. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Harrison, sitting beside Kathleen, remained perfectly still. "I'd like to hear from Miss Frady," said Margaret Chen, the CFO and one of Daniel's oldest colleagues. "Before we vote on anything, I think she deserves a chance to speak." Julian's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Fine. Miss Frady?" Kathleen stood. Her legs were steady. Her voice, when it came, was clear. "You're right about one thing," she said, looking directly at Julian. "I was dying. I am chronically ill. I've spent the last 2 years working through pain that most of you can't imagine, taking medications I couldn't afford, choosing between treatment and rent, treatment and food, treatment and survival. I've collapsed at work. I've lied to my employer about why. I've done everything possible to hide my illness because I knew the moment anyone found out, I'd be labeled exactly what you're labeling me now: unstable, incompetent, untrustworthy." She paused, letting the words settle. "But here's what Mr. Julian Parker doesn't understand. Daniel Parker didn't choose a healthy person. He specifically chose someone who knew the value of life when it's hanging by a thread. Someone who understood what it meant to be invisible, disposable, ignored by a system that only sees profit margins." She pulled out Daniel's blue leather folder and set it on the table. "Your uncle spent 2 years documenting cases like mine. Employees of this company and their families, drowning in medical debt for chronic illnesses that Parker Pharmaceuticals refuses to research because there's no money in compassion. He proposed the Parker Compassion Initiative, a research division focused on rare and chronic diseases. He was going to present it to this board 3 weeks from now. This is," Julian started, but Margaret held up a hand. "Let her finish." Kathleen opened the folder. He was also documenting something else. Financial irregularities. Small amounts, carefully hidden, diverted from research budgets into shell accounts. Over the past 5 years, approximately $2.3 million has disappeared from this company's books. She looked at Julian. "Your uncle knew. He was building a case. That's why you fought the Compassion Initiative so hard, because his investigation would have exposed you." The room erupted. Julian's face went white, then red. "That's slander. It's documented." Harrison stood, placing a second folder on the table. Bank statements, email chains, transfer records. All compiled by Daniel Parker and now in the possession of the company's attorneys. "We can investigate quietly, or we can involve the SEC. Your choice." Julian sat down heavily, and for the first time since Kathleen had met him, he looked small. Margaret picked up Daniel's proposal, scanning it quickly. The Compassion Initiative. A dual-structure model, traditional pharmaceuticals funding research into chronic illnesses, treatments offered at cost to patients who can't afford them. She looked up at Kathleen. "You're prepared to run this?" "I'm prepared to finish what Daniel started," Kathleen said. "I've spent 2 weeks learning this business. I have Dr. Chen managing my health. I have Harrison managing the legal aspects. And I have something none of you have: I know what it's like to be the patient you're all ignoring." Margaret looked around the table. "All in favor of implementing the Parker Compassion Initiative as proposed?" 8 hands went up. Only Julian and Veronica abstained. Motion passes. Margaret smiled, and it was genuine. "Welcome to the board, Miss Frady. Daniel would be proud." Epilogue. 6 months later, Kathleen stood in front of Parker's booth, formerly the DNL Diner, and felt something close to peace. The renovations were complete. New equipment, updated dining room, but booth 6 remained untouched. The brass plaque still hung above it, and every morning at 6:30, they left it empty for the first hour in Daniel's memory. The Parker Compassion Initiative had launched with 3 research projects and a patient assistance program that had already helped 200 families. Kathleen spent her mornings in the foundation office upstairs from the diner, reviewing grant proposals and talking to researchers. Her afternoons were split between board meetings and her nursing classes at the community college. Her health had stabilized. Dr. Chen called her a success story, though Kathleen knew it was just good medicine plus resources most people never got. That's why the initiative mattered, to make those resources available to everyone. Harrison visited weekly, always ordering black coffee and sitting in booth 7. Rita ran the diner with fierce efficiency. And every morning, Kathleen made a pot of oatmeal, plain, water only, no dairy, and thought about the grumpy old man who'd seen past her illness to the person underneath. Daniel Parker had given her more than money. He'd given her proof that kindness wasn't weakness, that suffering could be transformed into purpose, and that sometimes the people we save are saving us right back. She picked up her nursing textbook and smiled. She had work to do.